get started with you. Um, so thanks all for coming tonight. So as I see who's here tonight, many of you have attended programs through the library via Zoom. So you know the protocol that if you would mute yourselves at the beginning, and there will be a question answer period at the end of the program. If you want to submit questions or comments in the chat, feel free to do that anytime. I will be monitoring that for Erin tonight. So we appreciate you coming out to our program tonight. Our I can call it a Tuesday night series. So we're glad you're here. Um, and I will now welcome Erin Bartels. So Erin grew up in Bay City, Michigan. She has won a number of awards, most recently the Michigan Notable Book Award, or Erin, you can correct me if I'm in error about your your awards and exactly when. Um, so some the words between us, all that we carried, are a couple of her titles. We Hope for Better Things, I think, is one she plans to talk about in particular this evening. Her stories are all set in Michigan, so that is something that in particular that we can all connect with. I've seen a variety of complimentary comments about her writing style and her well-developed characters, and so we are pleased to have Erin with us tonight.
Thank
So
you.
Erin, the
Okay.
the set is yours.
All right. All right. Thanks guys for tuning in tonight. I appreciate it. It's been a weird, year of and actually this was the last day last year that my son had school. So thankfully he's been in school this year. They have a very small school, and so he is able to attend, which is great. Because I work full time from home for a publisher, and I have for about, well, I've worked full time at home for about 15 years. I've worked for this publisher for 19 years. So I've worked with books for a really long time, and I've worked with other authors for a really long time. And I was an English major in college, was one of those people, like I'm sure you are, if you're involved in library programming, that always loved books and loved reading books. And I think I knew for a very long time my life would have something to do with books. And when you've read enough of them at some point and you write as well, then you think, well, I could write a novel. And so I'll talk a little bit about how I got into writing, and about my debut novel, which is We Hope for Better Things. And in case you haven't seen it, I have a few of these guys, and I'm just gonna hold them up so you can see what it looks like. So that was my debut novel. But just because, I was an English major and I was always told, I always got good grades, and I was always told that I was a good writer, doesn't necessarily mean you would be a good storyteller. So there's a very big difference between writing and telling a story. And I'm actually not a great storyteller in real life. I'm much better on paper than in off the cuff conversation. I often start a story and then realize about halfway through, this is going nowhere. And I guess that's why I chose fiction to write, because then you can just make it up after that. But I started working for Baker Publishing Group, which is out of Grand Rapids in the Ada area. So I'm in West Michigan, but quite a bit further from the lake than you are. I started working there out of college when I was 22. And most of the time that I've been there, I've actually been writing the back cover copy and catalog copy for books. So all the stuff that tries to get you interested in it enough to pick it up and buy it or take it out of the library is what I do for other authors. And I've been doing that for a very long time now. And in the process of being involved in that business and in that job, I've met a lot of really wonderful authors and editors and agents and marketing people and all the sort of different people that come together to make a book. And I think because I work in publishing, it was kind of demystified for me. I think a lot of people have this idea of somebody who writes books or writes novels as somebody who's basically on their own, and then they send something off to someone and they're like, oh, sure, this looks great. And then it gets edited and there it goes. Well, it's actually a really collaborative process, and there's lots and lots of people involved. And for good or ill, the author is only one of those people. And one of my favorite parts of my job as a copywriter is I'm involved in titling meetings for books. So most authors don't actually title their own books. They'll have a title on it, but usually the publisher decides to go with something else. I think that surprises a lot of people. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that when you write a book, you're really familiar with the content, but when you title a book, or even when you write back cover copy for it, you are thinking of a person who knows nothing about the book, right? So when you come to a book, you see the title, you see the cover, maybe you read a little bit about it. And it usually is better if it's done from an outside perspective. So I've spent a lot of times working with titling other people's books. And I will say that all of my books have had titles that I have chosen, but it has taken a while to get there. They didn't start with those titles. And then there's back and forth with your team. And it's a fun part of publishing, collaborating with other people. So a little bit about how I came to write We Hope for Better Things. I started thinking about this book, the concept, in about 2011, I think, 2011 or 2012. And I spent all of 2013 researching. It's a book that has 3 different timelines, and it takes place in the present day, 1960s and 1860s, all in and around Detroit and Lapeer, so on the east side of the state. My family is from Detroit, and so I have a great love for that city. They're from different parts of Detroit. My mom is from Detroit. My dad is from Bloomfield Hills, which is very different. But that kind of dynamic between Detroit, and the suburbs is kind of present in this book. And I initially had this idea of a box of photographs that was found or given to someone, and she didn't know who had taken the photos. The person who took the photos wasn't in any of them, because of course, when you're the person in your family who takes pictures, you're rarely in them. So growing up, my dad was that person. He was an amateur photographer. He had 2 hobbies. He had photography and he had stereo systems. He's an audiophile. And they're both expensive hobbies, so he had to choose one. And he eventually chose stereos. But he was a great photographer, and he taught me to be a photographer as well. And so for a very long time, until I had a phone that could take selfies, I wasn't in any pictures either. But I got interested in this idea that you could have the pictures someone else had taken, and what could you learn about the person who took the pictures, even if they weren't in them? So that's how this book begins. It begins with a box of photographs that are given to a woman who works for the Detroit Free Press, and she is told, these belong to a relative of yours, a relative she's never heard of, and they want her to get this back to this relative. And so that's kind of what kicks this off. And in the course of learning who this woman is in her family, and learning who took the photos, and learning her own family history, which she really didn't know, you go back to the 1960s and you experience, I think, 64 to about 67. And the main event there is, of course, the Detroit riots in 1967. And then also in the course of meeting this woman who is much, much older than her, she's her great aunt, she learns about another generation or 2 back. And that's the story in the 1860s. And so the book explores a lot of themes about the Civil War and the Underground Railroad and the Civil Rights era and interracial marriage and all these different things from a Northern perspective. And I was interested in doing that because I think that you read a lot, or you see a lot of movies that come from a Southern perspective on those topics. And I didn't really know many that were from a Northern perspective. And I wanted to explore that because Michigan has a great history, a really interesting history of being deeply involved in abolitionist movements and the Underground Railroad and various other things. And I wanted to learn about those things, and you learn about them by researching. And that's what I did during 2013. And then it takes a while after that to write a book. I did the first draft rather quickly, in only about 2 months. I started on January 1st, 2014, and I was done, I think, March 3rd. And then I started revising and revising. And the process of publishing involves getting an agent, the agent then approaching publishers with your book and pitching it to them, then getting a contract, then editing on all these things, all these different steps. So that ended up taking a lot of time and much more than I kind of thought it would. So from concept to actually being on the shelves was about 7 years. Which was a long time to work on one project. And I didn't just work on that project, actually. The same year that I finished the first draft of We Hope for Better Things, I also wrote the first draft of my next book, The Words Between Us. And I was just revising both of them at the same time and looking for an agent. And what I was very interested in doing was not putting all my eggs in one basket. What if nobody cares about this story as much as I do? I want to make sure that I have something else to offer. And so I just kept working. And I was lucky enough to get a good contract. I got a 2-book contract with a publisher that I actually work for, which is kind of weird in its own way. But it's been really a great experience. And the book that I have that just came out in January is my 3rd book with them. Well, let's see. Let me tell you just a little bit about this one first. The Words Between Us takes place in a fictionalized version of my hometown. So I grew up in the Bay City, Essexville area, and this fictionalizes it, which is fun because then you can do whatever you want with it. And that's a story of a woman who kind of hides in books. She is literally hiding by going by a different name. She has, her parents were arrested in a very public way when she was younger, and she was sent to live with her grandmother in this little dinky town that she did not think much of. And it's kind of a back and forth then and now story of her now and her when she first came to live there. And she finds solace in reading classic novels, and she's sharing these classic novels, all the sort of stuff you had to read in high school, with a friend that she meets there. And so it's kind of told in this back and forth way where you're seeing how she's connecting with people in books so much more than she does in real life. And I think a lot of people who love to read like that book because it's just all about books. And then the one that came out in January is All That We Carried. And it's set in Michigan as well, in the Upper Peninsula in the Porcupine Mountains. I don't know if any of you have ever been hikers, but my sister and I are avid hikers of Michigan's trails. And so I draw from a lot of my own experiences there. And it's a story about sisters. So even though it took 7 years to get that first book off the ground, once you're going. And I've then had 3 books come out in the course of 2 years. And I have another one coming out with the same publisher next January, and I've just been offered a contract for another one. So I'm really working and writing constantly. But I like setting things in Michigan because honestly, I love this state. I'm a huge ambassador for this state. I think people are irritated by how much I talk about how much I love it when I'm with people who aren't from here. And I've always been perplexed and sort of angered and frustrated by people who grew up in Michigan and don't like it. And I want to re-educate those people as to why they should like it. There's so many amazing things about our state. I mean, you know, because you're on one of the lakes. Now, listen, I'm stuck in the middle of the mitten here. I'm living in Lansing, Michigan. I'm as far away from the Great Lakes as you could possibly be. And you know, when I grew up in the Bay City area, which I did not know until I was an adult was considered up north by people from Detroit. So we always went down to Detroit to visit family, and they considered us up north. And I'd always wanted to live up north, and I didn't know that I actually did. And I didn't know it until I was no longer there. Such a shame. But you grow up around sailboats and drawbridges and freighters and things like that, and you really miss it when all you've got is, you know, corn around you. Although I will say it's really fun living in a college town. So lots going on in normal years. And usually I'm very irritated when the students move in because about 50,000 people move into our area every August. And I will be so happy to see them next year. I don't care how it snarls the traffic. I miss them. So I do live far away from the Great Lakes, but I have such love for them, and especially Lake Superior and all of the beautiful scenery up there, and Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore and all the waterfalls. And so I really love to bring those types of things out in my books. And also love for a city like Detroit that has seen some really dark days. I still love it. And I still tell people that I think that things got bad there at just the right time, so that they didn't have money to replace all these beautiful buildings. They didn't tear a bunch of stuff down and replace it with terrible 70s architecture because they didn't have the money. It's so beautiful. It was built up at the perfect time for the architecture that's there. It's just wonderful. So I'm always an advocate for our state. And so that's why I set my stories in our state. So that's a little bit about how I got into publishing. What I love best about these sorts of situations, I really love having conversations and interacting with people. And I'd like to hear any sort of questions that you might have about the publishing business, or about my own experiences and how they relate to my books, or the themes that are found in my books, or anything like that. I'm not sure exactly what to focus on for you guys because I don't know who's read any of these. If any of them have, if you've read any of them before or heard of them, or the types of things that you like to read. So I'd love to hear from you.
You know, in your work, how many books do you read in a typical month?
That is a great question. So I have counted up the number of books I work on, and the number of books I work on versus the number of books I actually read is an extremely different number. So I work on average, I write copy for 165 books a year. Now, if
Wow.
you break that down with working hours and how many days you work, and I've been at my company for a very long time and I have 6 weeks of vacation. So like I'm not working the whole year. But if you break that down, you get about, what did I figure out? About a day and a half per book. Now, I can't read all of these books, mostly because they don't exist when I'm supposed to start working on them. We start writing copy for things a year in advance. So right now I'm writing copy for our spring 2022 list, and I'm writing the catalog copy. Now, unless you're a debut fiction author, almost all of those manuscripts don't exist yet. The writers haven't even started, or if they've started, they really don't have much for you. So the way that I do my job is when a book is proposed, there'll be materials, like a proposal and things like that that tell you about the book. So I'll have that. And then we also send all of our authors a titling and positioning questionnaire and hope that they fill those out thoroughly. They often don't. And usually it's the ones who don't that you have the least information on that are the pickiest about things, as people tend to be. So I work from those types of materials to write the copy. The one thing I do try to read is fiction by new authors. So I will, in the time that I have where I can actually set time aside to read, I will prioritize that, because fiction is a lot of the way that you sell fiction. It's not necessarily about what the plot is. It's really more about what do I as a reader get to feel while I'm reading this. So you introduce your couple main characters, the basic conflict that starts it all off. But what I really want to know as a reader is, am I going to like this voice? Am I going to feel immersed in this story? To me as a reader, and all people are different, I almost don't care what a book's about. I want to feel a certain way when I'm reading a book. And I know that a lot of people who love suspense or mysteries, like that's my genre, that's all I'm going to read, or romance, they have certain expectations of a book. I don't care what the plot's about. I just want to follow interesting people in an interesting place who have an interesting problem. And when I'm working on new fiction, then that's what I need to figure out, like, how is the author telling the story? So those are the books that I try to read. And then authors we've worked with for a really long time, I know how to write for them. I don't need to read their books. And I don't have time. And I'm a really slow reader. So what I do for work, and I do this in my own writing as well, when I've written a lot, and I want to go through and I want to hear how it sounds, I want to do editing and revision, I digitize it so that it's read to me by kind of a cyborg sounding voice, but a voice nonetheless, where I'm listening to these books while I'm doing other things. Because if I read it myself, it's going to take way longer because I'm a really slow reader, because I'm a really close reader. I know a lot of people who read really just, I don't know how they read, 3 books a week. It's crazy to me. My mother-in-law is a voracious reader and she just can't stop reading. And I don't know how she reads so fast because I'm a really close reader. But yeah, that's a really great question. I think a lot of people wonder how much of a book is actually read by the people working on it. And it would surprise you how little. That was a great question though. Does anybody else have a question? You can put it in the. All right.
I'm trying
You
to
want me to
unmute
stop
everybody
talking?
and
Let
I
me know,
muted
Dennis.
you. I've done that. I'm so sorry.
No, you're fine.
I'm trying to check and make sure that everybody else is unmuted.
Well, everybody else is muted at the moment, but if you have I know a lot of people are a little shy about asking questions, and you're certainly welcome to put them in the chat. But it's definitely been helpful to work for a publisher in going through the process of publishing. When I was moving up to my debut novel year, so starting in about July 2018, I joined a Facebook group for debut novelists 2019, which was a really great group of people. It was people who had written all sorts of different types of books, types of novels. It was just adult, and I don't even think we let young adult people in. We're just adult. And it was a great support for us to be able to talk to each other and ask each other questions. But one of the most interesting things about this group was I was one of the only people who was involved in publishing in a professional capacity. And most of the people who were in that group rarely had any idea what was going on with their book because their publisher wasn't communicating with them. And of course, I work with all the people who were publishing mine, so I could just ask them. And they were really nervous about bugging people and asking dumb questions. So I found myself answering a lot of questions about how the process works, and then also saying, just ask, it's fine. It's okay to ask questions. So if you're nervous about asking questions, don't be. I'm really nice. I don't bite.
So one thing that occurs to me, so you talk about, and I appreciated hearing why it is that you set so many stories in Michigan, and that you're, that you're such an advocate for the state as a whole. Are there particular things that inspired you, like particular characters? Were there particular events, or, I mean, can you talk just a little bit about kind of where your stories come from?
Yeah. It really depends on the story, but I think that there's a general pattern. So I haven't based anyone in any of my books on an actual real person. In the one that's coming out this coming January, there is basis in reality, some of my own experiences as a young person. Okay. But like the story about sisters, I have a sister that I hike with, but the sisters in the book are certainly not us. But of course, you draw from a lifetime of being a sister, close in age and often butting heads. But like the idea for, let's say, my second book, The Words Between Us. So The Words Between Us, I had a memory Well, it was sort of a memory slash idea. I'll tell you one thing. All good ideas come in the shower or in the car. That's where they all happen. When you're not actively thinking about something, but you've left white space. So I commute to Grand Rapids from Lansing once a week in a normal year. And that commute is extremely easy. I don't have to think about it. It's essentially one road. And so lots of ideas come to me when I'm doing that because it's something that I don't have to think about. And same thing with the shower. You don't have to think about what you're doing in there because you do it every day. And with the words between us, I remembered when I was a 14 to 15-year-old girl, I had a very good friend who was a couple grades older than me, and it was a guy, and we hung out a whole bunch, and then our friendship kind of fell apart, and I was really angry, and everything that he had ever given me, I put in a box, and I asked my mom to drive me to his house, and I left it on his porch, and that was it. I was never going to talk to this person again. Not a real nice thing to do. And in retrospect, that was a terrible, way to end a friendship, but I was 14, 15, and sometimes you do things like that. And I was thinking about what if somebody had just slammed the door on someone, gave back something that they had given them. And what if 20 years later it showed up in the mail? And that's kind of how that story begins. This book shows up in the mail that she had given back to this person in her past. And now it's kind of opened up that unresolved situation. And that's what kicks off what's happening in the plot. So that idea came in the shower. And the way I harness ideas in the shower is, this is the other thing I advocate for. I'm an ambassador for Michigan, and I'm also an ambassador for Aqua Notes. If you are doing anything creative and you get good ideas in the shower, you need to look up Aqua Notes. It is, there are these pads of paper, waterproof paper, and a waterproof pencil, and you stick it on your, shower, and you have these ideas and you just write them down. Because if you don't write them down, they're gone. They're gone. Doesn't matter how hard I keep thinking of them. Like, I'm not going to forget this. I will forget it. And usually it's because some other idea pops in. And so I wrote it down. And then, as I'm developing a book, I'll write tons of stuff in the shower, and you peel those things off. And if you have, any amount of moisture on the side of the shower, you can just stick them up everywhere. So you've got all these notes everywhere in your shower, and every day that you go in there, you can review them. And that's important for people who don't have a lot of time, right? You got to use the time you have well. So that idea just came from a memory of something kind of mean that I did as a kid. And then with a novel, of course, the trick is it's a long story, and you have to have an idea that you can sustain for the whole book. So a lot of times it's an incident that comes to mind, some sort of inciting incident, but that's not enough for a book. And so you kind of have to wait as things enter into your sphere, enter into your life, and you stick them to ideas that are already there. So you might get another idea 3 months down the road and think, oh, I can integrate that with this original idea. And so it can be memories, it can be experiences that you have out in the world, back when we went out in the world. It can be a photograph, it can be a news story. And it's not necessarily like you hear a news story and you're like, okay, I'm gonna fictionalize that account. It can just spark something else in your mind. And so it's once you have a certain accumulation and you feel this sense of, okay, I've got enough to start. And that's kind of how my ideas work. But they usually start with just kind of a notion of, oh, that's kind of interesting. And I think the notion of that's interesting usually comes to me before a character idea. And the characters kind of grow out of that initial thing. And a lot of people like to ask writers, are you somebody who plots out all of your stories, or are you somebody who just starts writing and you see where it goes? And I'm more the second one. I'm more of what they would call a pantser. I would never be very good at writing a suspense novel or a mystery or something that was very plot heavy. To me, my plots come out of the people that are populating them. So that's, I think, why people notice my characters when they're, reviewing my books. It's that it really is, out of these characters. And I really try, even with antagonists, to write from their perspective. So even the bad guys in the story, even an antagonist is a protagonist in their own head. Nobody does anything to be evil. They always think they're doing something right. They always think they're making a logical choice. And a lot of interesting plot comes from when you give characters kind of equally bad choices. And a lot of times you run into that in life. Life is full of, equally bad or equally good, or should I take this job? Should I not? Is there a wrong answer? And so I find it really interesting to put myself really in the shoes of whatever character, not just the protagonist, but all the other characters in the book, and think, what would they really do in this situation, and why, and how would they rationalize that to themselves? So that's kind of how my plots develop, is out of, you have kind of an initial incident, you have these characters, and what would happen next? And so I did plot out one book once when I was proposing a book to my publisher, which they ultimately didn't take. And I was really glad they didn't, because once I plotted it out and I wrote the whole outline, I felt like I'd already written it and I wasn't really interested in it anymore. Like the fun to me is discovering the story as you go along. And, then you have to go back. If you discover by the end of the first draft, like, oh, this is what this book is really about, of course, you're going to have to go back and you're going to have to plant things earlier that kind of lead to that, or you might change significantly some of the things you wrote earlier because they don't really fit anymore with what you're trying to say. But that to me is the most fun part of writing. So good question.
Anytime.
Yeah.
So do any of you, I want to.
There's one in the chat.
Someone in the chat?
Oh, she sent it directly to me, I think. Do you
okay.
work a lot with the visually impaired? Do you know if your books are available as audiobooks? Yes, I do know that. All 3 so far have been available as audiobooks. And I believe the company that has done them is just called Recorded Books. You can find them on Amazon. I don't know if they're sold. Like, I don't think any of those things are sold as CDs anymore. It's all MP3s. It's all stuff that you would either listen to through Audible on your phone or download, and you can listen to it. It's all going to be digital. And it's interesting that you ask if I work with the visually. Oh, you work with the visually impaired. Okay. Well, that's very interesting to me because the story that I'm working on right now has a blind character, and so I've been researching people who live with blindness and things like that, so that I can realistically portray this character. The story that I'm working right now is actually about 2 musicians, and I'm really, really enjoying it. I'm actually learning in the course of writing this novel about musicians, which I'm hoping will be coming out in January 2023. I'm learning how to do songwriting. So one of the fun things about writing is just how much you get to learn while you're doing it. So when I was doing a book about our sort of national history with race relations, I already knew a lot of that because I was already a history buff. But of course, you learn so much as you're researching. One of the best books I read researching that book is called The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. And I highly recommend it. It's about the Great Migration. It was really just fascinating and a well-written book. And then when I was, writing my second book that involves all the classic novels, I was recalling a lot of the classic novels that I read as a high schooler and as an English major in college. But I also reread some, and I read some that I kind of missed. The odd thing about being an English major at the time that I was in the 90s is that whatever your professor's preferences were is what you're going to get. So as an English major, I was never assigned ever to read Charles Dickens because he was passé. But I read The Great Gatsby 5 times for 5 different classes, which is too much. That's too many times. It's not that complicated of a book. But I really do love American modernism. So I just fell in love with those types of writers because that's who my professors liked. So I did reread a lot of that stuff. And in the words between us, one of the fun things that I got to do was she kind of pays her friend for these books by writing poetry. So she writes poems about each book. And so I got to include some poetry in there. And with the book that I'm working on now about musicians, I kind of get to visit that because, of course, what are songs if not poetry set to music? So I had no idea, I wasn't worried about writing lyrics. I knew I'd be fine writing lyrics, but I was not sure that I had any idea how to write a melody or anything like that. I can play guitar, but I'm not a guitarist. There's a huge difference. I'm not a musician. I am musical. And so my husband plays guitar and bass guitar and all that. And so I thought, well, I'll just have him do it. But I think he kind of wanted me to figure it out. So he gave me some hints and tips. And I've written, I think, 5 or 6 songs now for that. And
Awesome.
I'm really, really enjoying it. So it's a fun new thing to learn. It's really the best thing about being a writer is all of the things that I thought, as a kid, there were a lot of different things I thought I might do. I had a lot of different interests. And as you get older, you narrow your scope because you're asked to choose things. You got to choose a major. You got to choose an internship. You got to choose a job. And so you might be really interested and kind of good at a lot of different things as a kid, but you're not going to do all that as a career. But as a writer, I can do all those things as a career because I can write characters who do those things. So when I was, 11 or 12 and I was sure that I'd be the next Debbie Gibson, well, not really, but I can still write about musicians. I don't know if I'd call her a musician, but I'm having a lot of fun. And I'm setting the book in 1990, which is a fun year to revisit because it starts on the New Year's Eve of 1989 to 1990. And just remembering how hopeful of a time that was. I mean, and I was only 10, but I remember just how it felt like, oh, everything's better and it's always going to get better and it's never going to be worse. Things are, democracy is spreading and walls are coming down and people are being released from prison and, all of these sort of really hopeful things. And it's been really nice to spend some time in that really hopeful year during this really dreadful one. So I've been enjoying writing it.
Well, and I don't know who asked the question, but I did want to just say that one of the streaming and digital services subscription services that we have access to. So we hope for better things. All we carry, in the words between us, are we have ebook versions of that. So this is Libby is the app for Overdrive.
Uh-huh.
And so those are available. Just the ebook versions are available in Overdrive through Libby, but all that we carried, there's an audiobook version of that's available in this service that we subscribe to. So that's something that.
Yeah, and I guess I think that you can even get it through iTunes. Like, so if you're somebody who I think that's the case. I don't listen to a lot of audiobooks anymore. I listened to my obsession this past summer when I was working out in the yard a lot was a great podcast called The History of English, which is an extremely in-depth history of English, but it's fascinating to me. One of those things where you listen to it and, oh, that's so interesting. And you got to tell someone and you realize that, the only person around to tell is my husband or my 12-year-old son. And at some point they're like, yeah, I don't care. It's not as interesting to me as it is to you. So, oh well. But I don't listen to a lot of audiobooks because I don't travel anywhere anymore. And that's usually when I would listen to them. And if I'm going to listen to a book, it's something for work.
Yeah, that would be kind of the catch-22 about.
Yeah. There's a lot less time and mental power for like the books you would choose.
Right.
Yeah. And I have read some great books this past year. I To show how slow of a reader, I'm even slow to pick up a book that was recommended to me. I finally read a book that my college roommate recommended to me in like 1999 or 2000, and finally read it. She was right. I loved it. It took me 20 years to read it. Oh, but that was Bel Canto by Ann Patchett, and that was a fantastic book. And I also read Atonement by Ian McEwan this summer because I loved the movie and I just kind of wanted to see how he had done it in the book, and it was really fantastic. So those are the kind of the books that I would choose to read, are usually fairly slow moving character driven books, but for work I read all sorts of things. Although
So,
not usually the whole thing.
so the books that you typically read, well, you said there's some of the authors whose stuff you've written for or written about. You don't necessarily have to read the entire thing.
No, I don't. And it's so the company I work for is a Christian publisher, and so it's Christian fiction, and a lot of it is genre fiction. And I'm not a big genre fiction person, so romantic suspense, historical romance, things like that. And I wouldn't ever choose those for myself. That doesn't mean they're not great writers. There's some really wonderful writers. They're just telling stories that I wouldn't choose for myself. Although I will say, anybody who likes reading stories set in World War II, I would highly recommend Sarah Sundin, Sundin. She is a fantastic writer. She's written a number of series, but her most recent work with us is standalones. And the first one was set in Munich, and the next one's going to be set in Paris, and then there's going to be another one, and it's all Americans in Europe, kind of at the brink of World War II, and kind of getting stuck there, and somehow getting sucked into this this building conflict, and it's really good. She's a really great writer. So I would probably read her, but most of the people, and I do a lot with nonfiction as well, and I do love reading nonfiction, but very specific. I like reading history, biography of historical or writers, and I really love Bill Bryson. So A Walk in the Woods, and then a whole bunch of other stuff, but most people I think know him from A Walk in the Woods. And that was the first book of his that I read. And I was reading it when I was pregnant. And at some point I was laughing so hard and I couldn't breathe. And my husband came to the bedroom. He's like, "Are you okay?" He was so concerned because I could not stop laughing. I mean, what's so great about Bill Bryson or another author, Tony Horwitz, is they marry history with the present day. And like, here's how this all unfolded, but here's what's going on in these places now. And they do it with humor. And it's a fascinating way to learn more about the world we live in. So I really enjoy him. So
I'm pausing a little bit because I want to make sure if other people have.
Yeah. If you have questions,
so,
jump in, turn your video on, turn your mic on.
And I promise I will be more careful about not muting you, Erin. Make sure that from my end that everybody is. So everyone just know I'm not trying to out anyone or pressure anyone. I'm just trying to make sure that you can if you want to.
Right. Yeah, that's the thing. So we've been doing, my husband's a pastor, and we've been doing, church online for a very long time. We've had in person as well for a while, but there's still people who really don't want to come or can't come. Mm-hmm. And we always would mute people automatically when they came in, because if you don't, even though people are coming to church, there's always like a TV on back here, and like they're shuffling stuff around, and right. So it always gets pretty noisy. My husband's also a writer as well. Okay. So we often will write together in this very room. I'm in the back of my house right now, in our cigar room, which I think interests people sometimes, the fact that we have a cigar room. We had a sunroom and we realized we never used it. And I said, why don't we make this a cigar room? Because he loves smoking cigars. I smoke cigars. And so it's not connected to the rest of the house through any ventilation. So we just have fans that go out. We have electric heat out here. And so we can be cozy all winter long, which has been nice when you can't go anywhere,
Right.
Can't go to any cigar lounges right now.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
Yeah, you bet. Well, one of the things that I think is great about having folks like you, having access to folks like you, is that I think oftentimes there are, well, somebody like you who's accessible. I mean, who, you know, I think it's easy to look at someone, with I think any degree of celebrity and just think that like they're sort of like there's this chasm between us, and talking to folks and realizing that so yes, there are skills that you have honed, yes, and there are gifts that you have, and each of us has something different to offer, but that yeah, that it feels like, oh, this is kind of a real thing that real people do. You're a
Oh
real
yeah.
person, you're
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I always get irritated when I am I go to a lot of, in normal years, I go to writing conferences, and you
Sure.
hear different people talk, and some people are very accessible, and some people I think enjoy the feeling of not being accessible,
Right.
if
Yeah.
that's a kind way to put it. Um,
Kind
I
of
don't
both.
understand why anybody would want to be standoffish, and I don't understand how that helps someone's ego to be setting themselves above in any sort of way. One of my favorite things to do is teach writing and connect with writers who are a little further behind on their journey. And I'm involved in some writing groups where I can do that. I'm involved in a really wonderful group called the Women's Fiction Writers Association, and it's an international group. And what's so great about it, it's just a really giving group of writers. Nobody seems to be in competition with anybody else. Everyone who has experience in some way is more than willing to share it to help somebody else
Nice.
along the path. And I think that that's really the best way to be, no matter what kind of work you're involved in. Why wouldn't you be? It's not a zero-sum game. Just because somebody else succeeds doesn't mean that I don't. So I think that it's important to support each other as we're just getting through life.
Right.
And I think that one of the ways in which I think it's a double-edged sword being accessible on like social media or something like that. But I think one of the good things about a lot of authors and artists being on social media is that you see that they're just regular people. Their dogs pee on their kitchen floor too. They their cars break down, I mean, they do dumb things. They say things and stick their foot in their mouth. So it's all, everybody's just getting by. And I think that if there's an overarching theme in what I write, besides the fact that they're, set in Michigan and things like that, I think that I've noticed this as I continue to write more books, is that I keep coming back around to how we live in a really unforgiving world right now, where if you make even a small misstep, and even if you had no idea it was a misstep, then you're done. You are just canceled, forgotten, written out of people's lives, yelled at on social media, and there's no forgiveness, and there's not even patience. There's no forbearance. There's no long suffering. There's no listening, despite the fact that everybody pretends that they're listening to everyone else. And I think that I keep coming around to these themes in my work, that you can't undo the past. You can't erase the things that you said that you regret, or the things you did that you regret. You can't make it so they never happened. And so how are you going to go forward? You have to be somebody who can forgive and move on. And I think that in some way that'll come up again and again in a lot of what I write, this idea that the past happened, We need to learn from it and move forward and not continue blaming our present on someone else, whether it's our parents or the system or history or somebody who abused us or anything like that. That if you're going to live life, you have to take that step and ask for forgiveness and offer forgiveness. So that's kind of, I think if that is a theme that seems like it would be something you'd connect with, then you'd probably connect with probably most of the things that I write. So, well, are there any other questions as we come up on an hour? Hearing none.
I'm intentionally like saying, keeping quiet.
This is like, it's like when you're at a funeral and they ask if anybody wants to come up and share, and you don't want to wait so long that it's super awkward. Nobody has anything nice to say about this person.
Yeah. And I think it is fair and honest to say that my experience with a lot of folks who come to hear authors speak is that even if they're not asking questions, these kinds of discussions are the kinds of things that prompt that to sort of goose our thinking. And so even if we are not asking a whole lot of questions, hi Elaine. These are folks who still connect. They're connecting with what you're.
Oh yes. No, I'm
and...
saying that. One of the fun things about teaching, writing workshops, or I have done a number of programs with junior achievement going into high schools and talking to students who could really care less. They want you to talk about what you do for a living, and there'll be like one student in the whole class who cares. And I've taught a lot of Sunday school classes, a lot of them that focus a lot on history. I have a lot of experience with Roman history and Greek history and things like that. So I like to bring a lot of that in. And there'll always be one person who's nodding the whole time and making eye contact. That's me in a class, right? I'm like, yeah, I'm listening. And then most of the other people, you're like, I don't know if I'm boring them or if they're just thinking. Or
I know audiences are tough sometimes.
It's just part of speaking. So what's great is that most people on Zoom I can't see, so I don't have to worry about it. When you're in a room, then you're like, oh shoot, should I be funnier? Am I not as interesting?
So Elaine has posted
oh great, thanks for an interesting presentation. Thank you, Elaine.
Very nice.
Well, wonderful.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Erin. I'm just so, as I was saying earlier, I'm just so pleased that folks have decided that there are things that we can do. And I've said this to library patrons and a number of people, that this is a time where there's so much that we can't do. I'm just so pleased that there are things that we can do.
Yeah.
And folks like you have just taken the leap into this medium, make it
well.
play.
And I'll tell you,
we can do.
What's really impressed me is just most of the groups that I talk to, whether they're libraries or book clubs, I think that probably most of them, it's mostly women over 60. So I have to salute a lot of women who decided, all right, I'm going to learn how to do this thing that I've been avoiding learning how to do, because it's been great to be able to connect with people. And at this point, I feel like everybody knows how to do it. And there's not the kind of confusion there was at the beginning where, nobody knew how to mute or unmute themselves, or didn't realize they were on camera, or so it's been nice being able to connect with people throughout this past year. And in fact, the furthest afield book club that I connected with was in Honduras.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool.
And I never would have been able to do that,
right.
So silver linings.
Yeah. Well, and I fully expect that we will continue to offer things virtually, even when we have people in person again, that we'll broadcast some things. We
Yeah,
get
it's
people
easy
for
enough.
all kinds of programs who don't live anywhere near us but still want to participate. We'll figure out
Yeah,
some way
yeah.
to include people still.
Yeah, it's been fun to be able to connect with people that way.
Yeah.
So.
Well,
And I
Erin, thank
appreciate the
you.
invitation.
Oh, yes. It's our pleasure.
Well, great. At some point, I would love to see your town in person.
Well, you must, you know how to get a hold of me, I think. So
Right.
so
Now I
anytime
know.
when you're ready to do it. Well, then you said yeah, so you're on the other side. I live in Kalamazoo, so you're on the other side of me to get here.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you'd come not necessarily directly through Kalamazoo, but you'd kind of come past us because Bridgman, we're right off 94. So you take
Okay.
94.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, when you're coming through Kalamazoo, just honk your horn or.
All right.
So anyway, thank you very much. It
Yes.
was a
Thank you
pleasure.
very much, everyone. It was a pleasure. Have a good one.
Thank you, and you too.
Thanks.